Welcome, everyone. We're pleased to have you here for our second webcast, CARS webcast for 2022. I'm Beth Flynn Ferry. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Advanced HR Studies. And today I'm joined by Harry Katz. Harry is the Jack Sheinkman Professor of Collective Bargaining and Director of the ILR School's Scheinman Institute. And he also currently serves as the President of International Labor and Employment Relations Association, the ILERA. Work life, as you know it, has changed dramatically over the past 2 years. A host of factors, including COVID-19, enhanced attention to diversity, equity and inclusion, increased use of hybrid work models, has really challenged many long-standing assumptions about the employment relationship. This has led to a lot of changes in employee activism, as well as their expectations of the employee experience. Given these trends, it's not surprising that a recent survey that CARS did found that collective action and changing labor relations are high on the list of priorities of HR leaders for 2022. So I'm really happy to have Harry here today because we're going to dive a little deeper into this topic, leverage his expertise in this area, and really think about how companies are addressing these challenges today. So here's our plan for the next hour. As you can see, this is being recorded. I just wanted to let you know that. Harry is first going to take the first 20 minutes here, share some insights that have emerged from our early conversations on this topic with various labor and HR leaders. And throughout the presentation, we encourage you to post comments and questions using the Q&A or chat function in Zoom. And we'll field those questions at the end of Harry's remarks. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Harry.
Thanks, Beth. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Of course, I wish we could be together in person, but at least we can Zoom see each other, as we've all learned to do over the last couple of years. So what I'm going to talk about in these opening 20 minutes of remarks are the following 4 topics. I'm going to talk first about the increased number of strikes and intensity of strikes that has been occurring in the United States. I'll then talk about increased union organizing efforts and some increase in the success of those efforts. Then I'm going to talk about a related matter because it in part contributes to the increased strikes and increased organizing, and that's the increased collective activity that's been occurring by groups of employees of corporations and other organizations, nonprofits and public sector organizations too, groups of people that are not represented by unions or don't have collective bargaining rights. I'm going to refer to them as affinity groups, and I'll talk about their increasing role. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk about the something I've learned from many of the companies I work with and that I do consulting work with or teach with, and that is they feel that they have the absences, they refer to it, of a backbench of experts in labor relations. And we'll talk just briefly about why that's happened, but really focus more on what could be done, what can you all do facing increased strike activity and increased activism by organized and unorganized workers. How are you going to respond? Who's going to respond? What's their labor relations expertise? Okay, so that's where we're going. First on strike activity, and as you've seen in press coverage and probably know from other information sources, we've seen something of an increase in the frequency occurrence of strikes. There were 2 substantial strikes covered heavily in the press at John Deere and at Kellogg during the last several months. But when you look at wider data, you also see that there are indications of increased strike action. ILR actually started a new research project tracking all kinds of strikes, large and small. The government typically only tracks large strikes. Our research is called the ILR Labor Action Tracker. So if you want to learn more about where strikes are occurring and their frequency, you can look at that. It's on public access on the web. And what their data show is that over the last year, there has been somewhat of an increase in strike occurrence, larger than what had more frequent strikes and somewhat more workers involved than what had occurred for a few years before that. But at the same time, what that data shows is compared to historical occurrence of strikes in the 1970s or even the 80s and early 90s, the number of strikes is trending down. Some of that's because there's lower levels of unionization in the private sector, but also even where unions are controlling for the presence of unions, even the recent uptick pales in comparison to the frequency and the number of workers that had been involved in strikes in the past in the United States. So yes, there's something happening, but it's not the kind of large scale, massive events that sometimes the people in the press claim. What I want to do is mention a couple things that come with both a historical and a research perspective looking at strikes, and that is that it's not unusual. It's by no means unusual for the frequency of strikes to increase when the economy is doing well. We call this the pro-cyclical nature of strike occurrence. For 150 years, workers more frequently go on strike when the labor market is tight. So it's no surprise as the labor market has tightened, rather severely tightened, the unemployment rate has dropped, opportunities have increased for employees. Employees are increasing their strike frequency. Again, increasing their frequency somewhat, but not the kind of gargantuan increase that you sometimes sense that the press is claiming. The other question you can ask about strikes is, why are we having strikes now? Why, when conditions are better, do we have strikes? And here I turn to kind of the theory of strikes that I and many analysts of strikes use, and that is what history shows is strikes commonly occur as a result of a miscalculation. One or other side involved in the negotiation or demands at the workplace are overly optimistic about what they think would happen if there was an impasse and was a strike. That's what leads to a strike, miscalculation. So what kind of miscalculation happens during boom periods like we're having in the labor market? And I think it is revealed by the recent strikes that we've had. And although it's always hard to figure out exactly what's happening in a negotiation unless you're at the bargaining table in those discussions, the evidence is what's happened recently is consistent with evidence from the past. And during this situation in which labor market power has shifted somewhat to labor's advantage because of the tightening of the labor market, management is underestimating workers' willingness and resilience. And so what's happened during those strikes I've mentioned, Deere and Kellogg, from reports in the press, it's not that I've been at the bargaining table on them, I've just been reading the accounts, is as the strikes have gone on, management has improved its offer, has become more realistic as to what it's going to take to settle those strikes in the face of the increased bargaining power that their workers have, again, because of the improvement in the labor market. Not so surprising. Okay, the second topic, the increase in organizing. Covered actively in the press, of course, is the increased organizing that's led to a handful of corporate-owned Starbucks coffee shops that have been organized. As you know, there's also, if you're paying attention to the press, and I'm sure many of you are, there are organizing campaigns at various Amazon warehouses. There's 2 elections that are just occurring as we speak. One re-election at Bessemer, Alabama, at a large warehouse, 5,000 employees there, and another Amazon election in the New York area just occurring this week, and many other petitions for union representation elections at many other Starbucks. I think the count is over 100 Starbucks have seen some organizing campaigns, and then other Amazon warehouses, there's campaigns brewing. Okay, So what does the data and what does the research show? So one thing is just to keep in mind, it's not surprising, just as there are increased strikes and increased militants whenever the labor market improves and workers have more power. Historically, we know that union organizing tends to increase during conditions when the labor market improves. Workers become more aggressive in their demand. They're willing to take more risks associated with organizing and all. So in that sense, again, it's not so surprising there's more organizing activity going on. I think the question, of course, that you're asking and I'm asking is kind of, is this the start? Is this the tip of the iceberg? And we're going to see a massive increase in union success at organizing. I have my doubts. First, let me just remind you, the level of unionization in the private sector in the United States has dwindled down to about 6% of the private sector workforce who are eligible for union representation. People that don't have supervisory responsibility are eligible. Only 6% are unionized. There have been active campaigns over the last 20 years trying to reverse that. And what has happened is the decline in the share of the workforce represented has plateaued at around 6%, but it has not substantially increased in the face of increased organizing activity. So we shall see. This time may be different, but I have my doubts. And one reason I have my doubts is the fact that when you look at where other campaigns have occurred in sort of more traditional union areas where you would suspect the workers are kind of more sympathetic and sort of also able to absorb the cost of organizing in manufacturing areas, we've seen many campaigns fail. Let me just remind you, at Boeing, a very active campaign by the machinists to try and organize their facility in Charleston, South Carolina, where they now assemble Dreamliners, failed. The UAW was unable to organize in a number of the new foreign-owned, what are called transplants, at the Volkswagen plants in Chattanooga, at the Mercedes plants in Alabama. Really strong campaigns were run in those UAW sites. I happen to focus a lot of my research has been about the auto industry. I and many others actually thought the UAW would break through at Volkswagen, because initially Volkswagen was maintaining a neutral position regarding unionization. They've since changed that position, but they were neutral. We thought the UAW would succeed. It didn't in the elections. By now, there have been several that have occurred at Volkswagen. So again, a reminder that it's not so unusual by historical standard that there's more organizing. It is somewhat different that the organizing is occurring in the service sector at places like Starbucks coffee shops, but it's not so surprising there's more activity. What I do want to mention is the question, again, that I think you're asking, and I'm certainly asking, and many analysts are asking, is there something different about what workers want now? Again, particularly at the coffee shops of Starbucks, where there's a younger workforce. What do workers want? What do we hear from them as to what they want? And here I do think there's something different happening that may lead to a different outcome down the road, although I'm not quite sure of that. But there's certainly it's a sign of something that's a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. And that is, it appears that what the younger workers want is more engagement. And let me just mention a few ways this shows up. In my own interaction with some of the baristas, the coffee shop workers who were activists in the campaigns in Buffalo, what they say is the following. They say, to my surprise, we actually love our supervisors. They're doing a great job and we want to help them do even better. What our anger is, we're angry about corporate policy. The specifics of which piece of corporate policy they're angry about varies by worker and work site, but in general, that's consistent with other things I've heard from people who were interviewing the activists at the work sites. And by the way, it's also consistent with survey research that my colleague at MIT, Tom Koken, has been doing with his research teams. what Tom's research shows through expansive surveys of non-union employees is employees are now very sympathetic to collective action. This also shows up, by the way, in polls of various sorts. When you ask people, what do you think about unions? Their attitude towards unions have become much more favorable. So what does Tom's research shows? It builds on that observation that people are more sympathetic to unions and collective action. What his research shows is a sizable majority of non-union employees say they favor some form of collective action to improve their working life. But exactly what type of collection action they prefer, this is the key thing the research shows, is really, really varied. They don't always favor unions. And in particular, what shows up in the data is a significant number of the people who say they're in favor of some form of collective action. They're turned off by adversarial unionism. They don't want traditional unionism. What do they want? The survey evidence is they want more engagement. It's corporate policies that bother them. They want to be more involved in strategic decision making, or at least receive information about that. So I think what we see from that evidence is what you're facing, as I would put it simply, is a more demanding workforce, a feistier workforce, but not necessarily a workforce that ultimately is going to turn to collective bargaining to meet their demands, but definitely a workforce that expects more out of the corporation. Not so surprising given all the press about income inequality and the high earnings of executives, the high earnings of the super rich. In that sense, I'm not so surprised. It's consistent with this evidence that what employees are reacting to are corporate policies and not necessarily their relationship with their supervisor. I'm bringing this out because research in the past, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was starting in this field, when workers were surveyed about their views towards unions and organizing, they often said what's upsetting them is their relationship with their supervisor. When they were especially angry about that relationship, they turned to unions. But these days, again, the evidence seems to be people are being driven more by corporate policies, corporate practices, and all, and that's what's leading towards their activism. The third topic I briefly want to mention is, and I've already alluded to it, is the increase of activity of what I'll refer to as affinity groups. Groups of employees who don't necessarily want unions or belong to unions or have collective bargaining. They are contributing to the strikes. Some of those strikes, I mentioned at the start, involve employees who aren't represented by unions. We've seen a classic illustration of this kind of affinity group at Google, where several hundred employees, they actually call themselves a union. They're not a union. They're an affinity group of employees. They have concerns about Google's policies, and they're grouping together, communicating through the internet and through other means. We also see affinity groups in other parts of our economy, taxi drivers, people in healthcare, and others. I just want to remind you, our labor laws provide legal protection. The term in the National Labor Relations Act is protection for concerted activity. That means collective activity. Employees are protected in their rights to pursue concerted collective action, even though it may not involve unions or a demand for collective bargaining. So be careful with yourself and when you're advising others. When a group of employees sort of press their concerns about work conditions, they are protected in the actions that they take by our National Labor Relations Act. Now, a critical factor in the extent of protection and how it gets applied in everyday work life are decisions of the National Labor Relations Board. And the board, needless to say, is more sympathetic to collective action by non-union, unorganized employees during Democratic administrations. The Obama National Labor Relations Board made a number of decisions that were more sympathetic, supporting those kinds of actions. The Biden board has begun, and one would expect and pursue similar decisions and actions to support again, unorganized employees who work as affinity groups, pressing concerns they have about work life. The fourth topic, and this will be my last, and then I'll open it up to questions. There already have been some posted. And that is kind of a consequence of all this increased activism. Whether it leads to an eventual explosion or not, you're all facing more activism, more strikes, more organizing activity, and other kind of formal and informal actions being taken by groups of employees, collective actions. You need people who know the law, know how to respond to those collective actions. And what I've learned is many organizations don't have what they refer to as a backbench. They don't have veterans who have negotiated contracts, who are experienced in labor law, who have dealt with the kind of conflicts that emerge in labor relations. Dave Lipsky and I ran a consortium at the request of 4 large corporations, Boeing, Alcoa, Harley-Davidson, International Paper. For several years, we were convening meetings of those firms where they sent employees who they wanted to get more training and to learn from one another, primarily, not just from us, about how to respond to collective action, because they felt they were the senior people, the old guard, often white males like myself who had grown up in the field of labor relations. They were all retiring, right? Labor relations isn't a catchy field. It's not perceived as glamorous as human resource management among our students. Business schools aren't offering labor relations courses as frequently as they did in the past. And that, with retirements, has led to the dearth of experienced professionals who know how to deal with labor relations. Okay, so what can you do? What's my advice? I think there's 2 routes to respond to this absence, deficiency in the backbench. One is to turn to university training programs. I'm saying this not just because it's self-serving. ILR and Cornell have an extensive array of programs. Some are online, some are in person. There are other universities that have such programs. There are other entities, FMCS, Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, and others provide some kind of basic courses in labor relations. People can be sent to those and have experiential learning, not just listening to someone like myself just talk, but to engage in simulations and exercises, understanding the law, understanding negotiations, understanding how to respond to collective actions. And then the other advice I have, and I'm sure many of you have thought of this, is rely on internal rotation. Many, not all of your organizations, but many have parts of their organizations where there is some unionism. And you ought to be thinking about ways to rotate people through those parts of the organization so they can have a real experience with unions and everyday labor relations. Again, bolstered potentially by some training that they've received, but there's nothing better than a combination of sort of more, quote, classroom training, even though much of it's now delivered online, and actually having experience with negotiation and learning how to react to collective actions. All right, so I've made it through in my 20 minutes as promised. I'm now going to start responding to your questions and encourage you to post more. I have a little Q&A box there. And the first one from Florian, I hope it's okay if I mention your names when they're posted, ask, are there any particular corporate policies that tend to trigger collective actions? And I've talked a little bit about this, and that is, again, what seems to be upsetting people are things happening at the corporate level. We've seen it at Disney most recently, right? Disney, as you may know, has a lot of their staff are unionized, and they're upset about LGBT policies by the company in Florida and elsewhere. I sort of repeat what I heard from a barista who was leading organizing in one of those Buffalo coffee shops. She was upset about staffing norms that were being set by the corporation. In her discussions with her supervisor said, "Yeah, I want to do something different, but I can't go outside the corporate guidelines." Sometimes the issues have also been scheduling issues that are mandated by the corporation, and they don't have the flexibility at the local level to find sort of solutions that meet both corporate needs and the individual worker needs. So, and again, it's also some of it's atmospherics. I think people are upset about the inequality, the high earnings of the executives, the stock gains that get now reported in the press, and they're expressing concerns about that. And again, I think many of you have your own experience with this, and I'd encourage cars, if you're interested at some point, maybe the thing to do would be just sit around and share notes amongst yourselves about what you're facing. I wouldn't be surprised if, again, it's these kind of elevated social issues, sometimes with workplace direct consequences that are triggering action. Okay, so here's another question from someone, and that's great information, very helpful. Thank you very much. In terms of corporate policies, was there anything from your research in particular that companies should be mindful of? Is it more flexibility, more work-life balance, attendance policies versus strict adherence to maybe an antiquated employee manual? Yeah, I mean, my own advice, the way what I raise regularly in the labor relations training that I do is think about problem-solving solutions that meet the needs of the organization, but also respond to employee concerns. On scheduling, of course, it's more flexibility, but it doesn't mean it's unlimited flexibility. There's lots of ways to add more. People have, incredible difficulty meeting work-life balance issues now, not only those raised by the pandemic, but traditional family, dual career issues. And it just seems some organizations just get stuck in the rigidity of corporate policy, and it's just not going to fly anymore with this younger, feisty workforce, which again is supported in their feistiness by the tightening of the labor market. You just got to face it, the labor market is tighter, and you need to find ways, again, to problem solve and look for solutions that don't just cave into employee requests, just don't uphold strictly, rigid, standardized corporate policies, but find something in between. Beth, did you want to add to this, or go ahead?
No, you mentioned getting a group together to talk, about what companies are doing about some of these things. And we are going to have a working group specifically on this on April 27th. I'll show you our website later where you can head out there. But that will be kind of a mutual sharing around this. And then I don't know if you saw Kevin Cox from GE is on. If you see his thing in the chat and you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah. I just called up the questions that are surfacing in the chat, and Kevin's observing. It's nice to interact with you again, Kevin. I had the pleasure of interacting with Kevin a lot when I was serving as dean at the ILR school from 2005 to 2014, and Kevin was really supportive of CARS and ILR more generally. Anyway, Kevin's saying my observations, thanks, about the newer themes of employee activism and expectation resonate with him, especially among younger employees. Are the university training programs at ILR being refreshed to incorporate new trends and things? I try to get them to do that, certainly the ones I teach in and help design, but that's absolutely, I mean, we struggle just like you all do to sort of try and understand what's the same and what's different about current developments. Again, I'll remind you, some things are the same. The need for integrated problem-solving solutions that meet both needs. The fact that history teaches us that employee demands escalate when the labor market tightens. But then some things are new. I think the nature of the kind of activism we've seen, which I think helps us understand why it's surfaced in the service employer. I might add, that a handful of corporate-owned Starbucks have been unionized, but when you add up the number of employees that are now have won bargaining rights, we don't yet have the first contract from those negotiations. That often takes a while. It's a minuscule number. That's why I think at times the press gets sort of carried away. Yeah, we had a breakthrough in Buffalo when there's 2 coffee shops got organized. So that's like 15 to 20 total employees. Let me remind you the number of employees that voted in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that didn't vote for the UAW. That was 4,000 workers. The number of workers in Charleston, North Carolina, at that Boeing factory that is the complex work that put in to assemble those Dreamliners, that's 3,500. I mean, those are really meaningful bargaining units. It remains to be seen if the momentum of a few organizing victories at places like Starbucks accumulates to lead to something more substantial. The Amazon vote, I think, is a more telling one. I'll just remind you, in Bessemer, Alabama, there was an election last August that, as I recall, is something like 4,000 warehouse workers and the union there, the retail workers, and lost resoundingly. And then the National Labor Relations Board in that region ruled that the corporation had carried out a few unfair labor practices, something to do with the mailbox that was posted and some other things, ordered a re-election. That re-election is occurring as we speak. I'll be very interested, as you should be, in the outcome of that election, because the volume of work and it's just so much more significant than, not to diminish the importance of Starbucks. I mean, I drink Starbucks coffee too sometimes, but it's just much smaller scale. We shouldn't lose sight of that versus these larger elections where, again, in the past, unions have not succeeded even in the face of some very active and often very innovative campaigning. I and many others were often criticizing the unions, or at least reminding them that there was a weakness in many of their campaigns. They weren't connecting with the interest of younger workers, more diverse workers. They weren't connecting with community groups. Unions have been trying to respond to those criticisms, not just because they're criticisms from me, but from many other observers. And yet, again, even in the face of some novel efforts at Chattanooga, at Volkswagen, at Boeing, and at Amazon, where the workforces in some of those locations are heavily underrepresented minority, the unions have not broken through. So again, I think take it all with a grain of salt as to what's going on. Okay, some more questions. S. Halley, pleasure. Hi, Harry. Have you seen any best practice around tapping into employee voice grievance via new channels such as social media? Yes and no. I mean, again, I think first recognizing the need for organizations to respond to these collective concerns, affinity group concerns, in a manner consistent with the law and consistent with those organizations' longer-term human resource and labor relations policies is the first step. And then again, I would say don't be surprised that the issues being raised are not sort of narrow workplace ones. Yeah, people are still concerned about their wages, and at times they're concerned about the benefit package, but they're often now concerned about corporate policies, LGBTQA, rights policies of one sort or another are just becoming much more critical, and you've got to figure out a way to have conversations about those policies. Again, that doesn't mean you give away everything in the midst of employee pressure, but it does mean that you've got to be ready to have a response, and in my own view, welcome engagement. Many of you have terrific engagement practices and policies. I don't want to diminish those. I'm just saying you're going to need to elevate the importance of those programs, because again, you're facing what I would term a feisty workforce that, again, is feisty by nature and feistier because the labor market has tightened and hopefully will stay tighter for several years on that level. That's a wonderful development, but it leads to these consequences. Okay, someone, is the U.S. The only place where this is happening? Is there a global trends, and how in other countries do companies respond? Is there any learning? Well, so one thing to say is that the difficulties unions have had in maintaining or growing their membership is a widespread phenomenon. Now, unions in only a few countries have as little representation in the private sector as they do in the United States. In many other countries, representation is at the 20, 30, or in some cases, Scandinavia, 40% of the workforce. And here's more importantly, in many other countries, I don't want to go too far, I could do a whole lecture about comparative labor relations, but keep in mind, in many other countries, there's something called legal extension. It's the bargaining rights and obligations get extended to corporations, whether they're in Europe or in Latin America, where these national laws apply. They get extended whether or not you have employees in a particular workplace who are seeking union representation. You have to follow agreements that are reached by an employer association. So in that sense, there's something of a different trend in that, yes, unions are having a hard time growing in other countries, but they're not nearly at the weak state that unionism has gotten to in the private sector in the U.S. Responding to all this activism, I think, I and all of us, I think it's still an open question. It's hard to figure out exactly, given all the pressures of the pandemic and other things going on. I haven't seen any clear summary or anything I could recite to you that's kind of examples of how companies in other countries are doing it better. I will say they have different legal systems, as I've said, but I do know of evidence where they face similar feistyism, right? Their labor markets are getting tighter, not often as tight as ours. We've sort of done a better job recovering in some ways. But they face feisty young workforces, often active in the service sector. The Starbucks case is a more general phenomenon. So, but as to like classic better solutions, I wouldn't say that I've come across some from other countries. Let me see. I'm curious. Here's a question. I'm curious what trends you might see in your research regarding new or different union tactics. Okay, union tactics, if any, to reach employees to get to a petition campaign in the U.S. The key one is what I just briefly mentioned, is unions recognizing that they need to link with community groups and other, what I refer more broadly to, rights issues, women's rights, immigrant rights, civil rights, gay rights. Employee rights are often what's sort of underpinning a lot of discontent. I could have mentioned that even more forcefully earlier among employees. And so what you're seeing unions try and do, not yet with enormous success, again, don't forget that, let's not get carried away, but with, trying and with some success, is to link their campaigns at the workplace to employees' connections to community groups and rights groups. That is something that's somewhat different on the scene. I think rightfully so it's different. I give them advice just like I give employer groups advice. And I say, look, employees have this broader set of concerns. It's not just about, the wage or the benefit. Those things are not irrelevant. They matter. It's not just about seniority. It also includes a broader array of rights. And so that's the issue. Now, unions also, as you might suspect, are making use of social media and communicating, the activism in part. Look at Google. I had a wonderful student who tracked that activism, and what she found is a lot of this stuff was communicated through social media. Workers expressing their key issue was their frustration with the response Google management made to charges of sexual harassment against some of their senior executives and the use of mandatory employment arbitration. But the campaigns there, and it's true of where there are unions, there's much more use of social media. Now, I might add, I've talked to my friends who are management side attorneys as to what they're doing to respond to those campaigns, whether it's at Amazon, in Bessemer, and in other places. Management too is learning, as they have the freedom to use social media to respond. The employees, for example, in Bessemer, Alabama, that Amazon warehouse, were getting message after message communicated to them by management. Again, consistent with the law. This is not illegal stuff. This is rights that management has to express their concerns, their preference for direct communication, raising the fact that people have to pay dues, they're not guaranteed to have improvements in benefits, yada, yada, yada. But using social media on the management side And in some ways, to be honest, I will say this, that some of the people I've spoke to said, yeah, the unions started doing it more, but the management did it even better. And if you want to understand, they say why the union got beat so badly in the initial vote in Bessemer, Alabama, it was because management found a way to communicate so actively through social media. So again, that's a lesson. Social media works both ways. A way for management to communicate, just as it's a way for union or other employee activists to communicate. Let me just answer. Someone asked, "Do I see more ULPs?" And I haven't seen evidence of that. Unfair labor practices by organizations. You mean the Kristen question about PPG leadership team? Okay, I'd update to the PPG leadership team about how the newer themes in the external environment are impacting labor action. You've cited several examples. Do you have statistics that you can share, possible on a PowerPoint deck? Not exactly. I think what I would refer you to is there are terrific papers, research papers by Tom Kochen and his teams reporting on what they've found in their surveys of non-union employees. They, in my view, have the best survey evidence, not just because Tom's a close personal friend of mine and a co-author of many projects, but Tom is an amazing researcher. He has terrific research teams going. One of his research products was published several years ago in the the ILR Review, and another one is coming out very soon in the ILR Review. So you can click on the ILR Review, and I say that not just because coincidentally the ILR Review is published out of ILR, it just happens to be the lead research publication, and that's been the outlet for the findings of Tom, or you can Google Tom or communicate with him and read it. But that's the best evidence I've seen as to what is it that the workers want. And again, I can't overstate this enough, incredible diversity in what they want. At the same time, real openness to collective action, but it's not coalescing. That's part of the problem the unions are having, is it's not coalescing around one particular form of collective action. I think if it was coalescing more as to what employees want, we'd see more success in union campaigns. And again, we haven't seen that kind of broad success. We've seen pockets and pieces, just like we've seen pockets and pieces of more strikes, but it's not overwhelming.
I don't see any more questions. Any last chance here for people to type something into the Q&A or into the chat for Harry? Been really valuable having you, though, Harry, talk about the historical context and then what we see pulling into the forefront here as the labor market tightens, as people are used to having or want more control and are used to having maybe more control during the pandemic and really want to leverage that in their work life.
I mean, I will say, just you pointed out and said the word pandemic. I mean, someone asked, what are some of the issues? You see continuing issues about health and safety or at an elevated level. Not so surprising. I mean, we've all been heightened to concerns. I see it in the public sector among school teachers, obviously, we read about that in the newspaper. But it's also another concern about other employees. We face it at ILR, employees coming back in the office. They're really concerned about the health and safety conditions on the buses that they ride, or in New York City's case, in the subways that they ride. They're very concerned about people coming into our classroom to take those courses I've been mentioning. What kind of protection do they as employees face? And it's not surprising. I mean, all of our concern. And I will say, though, that that's an area where there's a real possibility for problem solving, what we call integrative solutions that can serve both sides' interests. Health and safety issues historically are issues where there's the potential, right, for real problem solving, because the firm wants there to be health and safety at the workplace. The workforce wants it. Sometimes it's really a lack of communication understanding, or sometimes it's just initiatives haven't been fully launched that can serve both parties' interests. It's not an inherently conflictual issue. It's an issue where there are joint solutions that are possible if the parties, are good at discussing things in a problem-solving approach.
One more question in the chat there, Harry. Do you think that having more union presence would channel grievances and allow companies to get people to discuss with in a more processed way?
So I'm of the view that unions sometimes do that, but sometimes don't. It depends on the relationships. You know, in some workplaces, unionized workplaces that I study, unions are a vehicle for voice. I mean, let me just add a little tidbit. Other countries, you know, I speak to a number of American-based corporate executives who were freaked out when the European Union in 1996 required European-wide works councils. And then they thought, oh, this is horrible. We're going to have these groups. And one after another, when you talk to those executives one-on-one without a recording, they have said to me, you know, that worked out for the better. We found a forum, in an organized forum, we could talk to employees about our strategic plans, and they had, you know, good, solid representatives, and they were willing also to go through some training to understand the business and where investments were going and why we were doing things. And it pushed us and got us to do things we could have and should have been doing, communicating all along. And so I think that possibility exists in the US just as it exists in Europe. Does it happen all the time? For one reason or another, that's a whole coursework load. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. Unions aren't a boogeyman. It depends on the relationship.
Yeah, and I think going back to this, whether you're a unionized organization or not, you know, having transparent, authentic leadership, engaging with your employees on the issues that are important to them and that are, you know, trending today are going to just serve you well no matter what. Great. Well, I want to thank you, Harry, for your time today, and thank everybody for dialing in. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.